Okay, we'll get started soon. Can everyone hear me? Am I coming in clear? So, feel free to type just so I know. I think this might be the last live conference I'll hold since next week is really the last week of class. And so today I just want to talk about the last assignment that you have to turn in. I'm reminded that this is the not just the last assignment, it's the last written assignment that you'll turn in, it's the last graded assignment that you'll do because there won't be a final exam, okay? And I believe I have it due on the 29th, which is a Friday, I think. As long as I get it in by the 5th, it's fine. The sooner you get it in, then I could grade it and I could give it back to you, and then we can see, what kind of work needs to be done for you to get a better grade if you need a better grade in the class. Again, I'll be taking this last assignment, graded assignment, as the assignment that will be the substitute for the final grade. So I want to make sure that everyone does a good job on this assignment. Also, if this assignment is better than the other assignments that you've turned in, then that grade will be weighed more for your overall grade in the class. Okay. Again, I'm not against giving people, the grade that they deserve. I always give students the benefit of the doubt when turning in grades. I just want to make sure that whatever you turn in is a good example of critical thinking. Okay. Any questions about that, the final exam, or any of that stuff? So there's no final exam. How many pages for the final essay? It's about 5 or 6 pages, because the essay itself will be in 5 parts. Okay, so you should almost imagine that each part should be its own page. Okay, again, I don't count pages, but as long as you have a good argument, that's what I look for. But seeing that it is a 5-part essay, then it should be roughly about 5 pages. If you turn in something like 3 pages, most likely it's underdeveloped and it lacks content. Okay. So because this final exam, final essay, is an important one, it's important that you do well on it, right? And hopefully it doesn't sort of ignore. You shouldn't ignore the other essays you turned in. You should definitely look at those essays, and if there's a consistency of issues that you have in those essays, you should find a way to improve upon it. Whether that be grammar or content. Last time, a lot of people didn't use the sources correctly, or even worse, that they cited by APA format instead of MLA format. All of that's correctable, right? And you should have gotten a higher grade if that was the case, right? So, again, look at the previous essays, see what mistakes that you made, if there's a consistency of the mistakes, and make sure that you don't repeat it for this final essay. Okay, I want to go through the final essays. I want to go through what's required in the assignment. And most of the time when I give this prompt out, people who don't do well on it is simply because they didn't follow the directions of the prompt. Okay. And it's important, at least for a professor, wherever you go, that you follow the assignment correctly. It's not simply a format issue. It is so that we can grade each individual student based on similar standards, right? So if you don't answer the prompt question, or you don't use any of the resources given to you as support in your essay, you'll be marked down considerably. Right. If you don't quote and cite in your essay, which is substantive to supporting your argument, then you'll be marked down. Okay. So again, a lot of these things are easy to miss, but they're significant in order for you to do well in the class. So my aim is to make sure that you do well on this assignment, so that I could justify the good grade that you'll get in the class. Okay, so let's start with the assignment. And at any time, feel free to ask me questions through the chat, and I'll be more than happy to stop and answer. Okay, so the assignment itself is about trigger warnings. Okay, so and if you look at the prompt, and this is why it's important to follow the instructions of the assignment, that prompt question is how you're going to form your thesis. Okay, so the prompt asks you whether or not there should be a mandate, in other words, a mandatory policy to implement or to put in trigger warnings, which is simply a sentence in the syllabus, right, for all college courses. Okay, so and again, this started, if you read some of the articles that I gave you, it started out in Santa Barbara. It's really been going through across the nations. University of Chicago has responded to such a policy, right? So it is a significant one. It's brand new. It really was developed in the last couple of years or so. Some colleges, community colleges, have a mandatory trigger warning policy. The LACCD, the district that this community college is part of, they don't have a policy of it. It doesn't mean that an instructor can't put a trigger warning in his syllabus if he feels that the material that he's presenting might be insensitive to some people. But it's voluntary, right? It's not a mandate. Okay, and so that's again, when you think about this essay, make sure that your thesis focuses on that prompt question. Should it be mandated that every instructor should put a trigger warning in their college syllabi? Okay. I could give you some comments on first drafts if you send it to me early enough, but since it's due next Friday or so, then it should be soon if you want me to respond to your first draft. Okay. You also have a tutor in the. You also have a tutor. That's my dog. In the class, use the tutor, right? If you know that you can't turn in something, you can't show me a draft by Wednesday. Show it to the tutor first, okay? Particularly if it has to do with MLA formatting, citations, using just the basic stuff, okay? But you know, there's a reason why we have an embedded tutor in the class. He's there to help, okay? So to go back to the assignment, so again, make sure that your thesis answers that prompt question, okay? The second thing you should make sure is that you address the mandate, this policy in terms of the First Amendment. Now, I should mention that the mandate itself doesn't violate the First Amendment, right? Because it's just a warning. We have warnings all the time. We have warnings with movies and with video games, right? We have warnings if the coffee's too hot. I mean, there's warnings all over society, right? And again, none of that is a violation of the First Amendment. Any type of warning or censorship, however, is a limit to the notion of free speech, right? Basically, it's asking you can't just say whatever you want. You have to provide a warning. And I should mention that some news broadcasts use warnings, right, before showing graphic material, right? So you get a news broadcast that would say, be prepared that what I'm about to show you might be insensitive to some viewers, right? So we're not, there's no aversion toward the notions of warnings. However, the more warnings that you have and the more censorship that you have, the more that you narrow down the First Amendment, okay? And the First Amendment, you know, you just can't haphazardly say whatever you want just because of the First Amendment. The First Amendment does have restrictions, like all amendments in the Constitution. It's only when it becomes outlawed or banned does it become a violation, okay? So make sure that you think about the mandate in terms of that notion of the First Amendment, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about academic freedom later, because really the notion behind the trigger warning policy is that it limits academic freedom, okay? Now, academic freedom is not a student. It's not for students, okay? Academic freedom is for professors, okay? You can't say that students have the right to learn whatever they want to learn in the class. That's not academic freedom. It doesn't follow. You can pick a material that doesn't follow the curriculum, and it doesn't do you any good. So students themselves do not have academic freedom, right? Sure, you could choose the class you want, but you can't choose what materials you want to be tested on in a class, okay? Academic freedom applies to the instructor. And the really main issue is that if an instructor wants to show or do a lecture on a reading that might have a vulgar language in it, or they want to show a video, or they want to show a picture of something that might be offensive toward viewers, as long as if it's used educationally, he should be allowed to use that. Okay. Now, unless it's porn, you know, and very few people do teach porn in class. There are some freedoms that academics have in order to teach. Or freedoms is really as long as the material suits the argument that you're trying to make or the theory that you're trying to present in the class itself. As long as it's a learning tool, you can actually teach whatever you want to teach, okay, with some limits, all right? So if I wanted to show like the Abu Ghraib photographs, or I wanted to show the Muhammad cartoons, which by the way I didn't, if you notice, I have links to the sites, but I didn't actually show you the Muhammad cartoons because I know how insensitive those cartoons are to people of certain faith. As long as I use it educationally through critical thinking, then it should be fine, right? If you taught the Muhammad cartoons in geography class or math class, which is completely irrelevant, then it's not fine. The professor can't say that he's using academic freedom to use that. I don't know how he would use it in a math class. So academic freedom is part of this issue, right? Does the professor have the right to show whatever he wants to show as long as he's using it educationally, or should he be sensitive to how the material is presented to certain students in the class, right? One of the reasons why I wouldn't show the Muhammad cartoons is I don't know who is Muslim in the class, right? Nor would I ask. It's none of my business to know the religious background of people. So I would have, and I do have, a trigger warning in my syllabus, but that's completely voluntarily, right? I do it so that students are prepared for what they're about to encounter in the class, right? So, again, make sure that the thesis answers the prompt. Make sure that you address the issue in terms of that First Amendment issue, or it's a First Amendment issue. Again, that's a broad term, but as long as you address it in some way in your essay, that's fine. Make sure that you use an example that was discussed in earlier lessons and how to implement or why you should implement such a mandate in the class, right? And so we talked about the Muhammad cartoons, the Abu Ghraib photographs, the Boston photographs, the ban on certain American classics like Huckleberry Finn or To Kill a Mockingbird. All of that can be used as an example, right, on how a trigger warning policy would impact a class, right? So again, that's all of that is part of the assignment, and so make sure that you address all of those parts within the essay. The other big one that I want to emphasize is that make sure that you use the readings that's given to you on the assignment, okay? And those include the readings in the lessons themselves. Now, you don't need to use all of those readings, right? In fact, I mean, there's way too many, right? So I would just find like 2 readings that you would use as sources to quote and cite from in order to support your argument, okay? I believe there's 2 articles that focus on trigger warning as an issue at a college, and then there's other readings that show how trigger warnings have impacted a college, right? And again, all of that is acceptable. You do not need to do any outside research for this paper. In fact, you shouldn't, right? You have enough material given to you that you can simply use the material to support your argument. And again, you don't have to use all of the material. There's like 4 or 5 resources that I give you. Just focus on 2 of them, right? And that should be fine. Okay? So again, go through the instructions to the assignment, go through the lessons, and you should be fine. Okay? Where are we to incorporate these examples? Do I need an extra paragraph to mention them? Well, for example, if you support trigger warnings, okay, so say, for example, you support a mandate on trigger warnings, so that if a professor presents to the entire class the Muhammad cartoons, right, and uses it in an instructive way, you can still argue that he's being insensitive toward Muslim students. And then we realize that trigger warnings are really meant for students that might suffer trauma. Okay, if a material is so graphic and offensive to a student, it might actually impede his education, right? And that's one of the reasons why, even as professors, even as we have academic freedoms, we have to be sensitive to what students see, right? And to me, a trigger warning is not that big of a deal. It's just one sentence in the syllabus, and it's enough to remind students that materials might be insensitive. There could also be a policy, which they have at Santa Barbara, that says that students who are offended by such materials would be given an alternative. So if I was presenting the Muhammad cartoons in class, an argument would be I should give students a warning ahead of time, because I wouldn't know who the students are in the class, if they're Muslim, and if they're going to be offended by it. Okay, I should mention that the Muhammad cartoons are offensive to anybody, even if you're not Muslim, right? But it's the portrayal of Muhammad as a figure, as an idol, is what's offensive to Muslims, right? There are Muslims who are completely fine with Muhammad cartoons too, right? So. But you're looking at these trigger warnings as really addressing a small group that might have significant impact on their education when they see the material. Another issue, and I brought this up when I actually started looking at discussing the Abu Ghraib photographs. And again, I never really showed the photographs. But even that one that I showed as part of the discussion was enough to trigger a student who was in combat, right? And that becomes PTSD, right? So PTSD is a a disability, right? And thus this can be a accommodation issue, right? And as a result, the student told me early on that he was reacting to the photographs, so I gave him an alternative lesson. Again, most professors are willing to do that without such a mandate placed upon them. But one would argue that before we show any of these photographs, so even that the discussion of people falling from buildings of 9/11, right, the fallen man, that's enough to trigger people particularly those who might be sensitive to graphic violence or have suicidal tendencies, right, might react that way. Again, as a professor, we do not know that. But if we have a trigger warning, that will allow the students to have, some heads up in order to deal with the topic, and or come to the professor to discuss how this topic might impact his overall education. Okay, so you can incorporate these examples pretty easily into your argument. You don't need an extra paragraph. I should mention that when I mean a 5-part essay, I don't mean it has to be 5 paragraphs, right? In fact, some people are writing very long paragraphs that go on past the page, and 250 words in a paragraph is pretty long. Right, you want to keep your paragraphs clear and concise and focused. Okay, so don't adhere to that notion that all essays have to be 5 paragraphs. You can look at an essay as 5 parts, and each part could have multiple paragraphs within it. Okay, so any questions about the assignment before actually going to the organization of the essay itself? Anything that should we cite them? You don't necessarily need to cite the lessons. You definitely need to cite the sources, right? The printed, published sources. The lessons that I give are published through Canvas, right? But it's part of an educational tool that you don't need to cite them. Again, only cite, if you want to cite the Muhammad photographs, Muhammad cartoons, or the Abu Ghraib photographs, only cite them if you are using a specific source and you're commenting on a specific detail that's mentioned in the source itself. Otherwise, both topics are sort of, known to the public, and it doesn't need citations. Okay. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned that. Really, you should only cite when you're quoting from a source, right? Most of the time, when you're summarizing an article or an event, you don't need to cite. But if it's a specific example, particularly if it's facts or figures, like data that you're using, all that needs to be cited. And also, you should cite any quote that you use. And actually, let me say something about quoting too. Sometimes you'll use a quote from a person being interviewed in the article itself, right? And there's a special way in which you cite that quoted passage, right? Because it's not written by the author, but the author wrote it down as part of his piece to be published, right? And so, say for example, you want to quote from President Trump. President Trump obviously didn't write the article, right? But after the quote from President Trump, you would put in parentheses QTD, which means quoted, and then you would put the last name of the author of the article, right? And then paragraph number, okay? Kyle says you do not need to provide citations when using information that's considered common knowledge, right? You really only should quote and cite when it's like specific figures and data that needs backing up, okay? When I was doing my essay, I had to stop because I have many questions. Well, hopefully I can answer most of these questions here, right? But principally, the argument that you want to focus on is whether or not there should be a mandated policy of trigger warnings in college syllabi, okay? All right, so let's talk about the introduction, if there's no specifics to it. And then again, I urge you to, before you even start your essays, to go thoroughly through the assignment. And even as you finish your draft, make sure you go back to make sure that you hit those bullet points of the assignment itself, okay? So in the intro, you could introduce where you basically define what trigger warnings are. You could even begin with the First Amendment and make that the sort of the broad scope before you narrow it down to a particular policy. And again, you can find all those definitions within the sources that I give you in the assignment or the lessons, right? Or you can summarize an event that occurred, right? So as I said before, trigger warning as a policy started off at my alma mater, which is University of California, Santa Barbara. It is sort of a nationwide policy now, where you have the University of Chicago is responding to the recommendation from the student government that there should be a trigger warning policy, right? Or you could summarize the event that happened in Crafton College, right, in California, where a student complained about her graphic novel class, and she thought that it was going to be just simply Batman and Superman, but then it turned out to be these novels that had controversial themes in it, right? In that particular case, she wanted the textbooks pulled from the class, but then she also added, too, if there was a warning ahead of time, then she would have known early on not to take the class, right? You could summarize either one of those events as sort of a starting point to your essay, right? Don't do all of the events. Just choose one that will lead you to what the trigger warning policy would be and whether or not it should be implemented, mandated, that all professors place a trigger warning in this college syllabi. Okay? All right, so that would be like the introduction to the essay. And note, too, that if you do it that way, you can also work your way into commenting on how this impacts First Amendment rights. Okay? And that since this is an argumentative essay, then you'll simply just follow that 5-part format or organization, right? You'll have support, a part that supports your thesis, a part that criticizes the thesis, so that you can have another part that counter-argues that criticism to your thesis, right? And those will be the body parts to your essay. And it is within those body parts that you'll use the example either about the Muhammad cartoons, or you can use examples that you get from the sources themselves. Okay, and then you have a conclusion, and again I'll address what the conclusion should be later. But that would principally be the organizational parts to your essay. Okay. Yeah, since this is an argumentative essay, you would have to agree to a side, right? And that agreement should be your thesis, and that thesis should come very early into your essay. Last time when people were writing their commentary essays, they put the thesis at the end, which you shouldn't do. A thesis should be just like a hypothesis for a research paper, right? It should be very early on in your essay. You should not wait to the very last part of it before you actually reveal what your argument is going to be about. Okay, because this is an argumentative essay or persuasive essay, you have to show both sides to the argument, right? Again, the reason why you present the criticism in your essay is so that you could counter-argue it, right? In other words, you should show both sides, but you're leaning toward one side over the other. Okay. Make sure that you quote and cite from your sources, and make sure that quoting and definitely the citing is in MLA format. Last time people turned in essays, particularly with the work citations, as APA, and that's completely wrong in an English class. Okay, you might think I'm a stickler about citations, but when you get to a university, you need to cite correctly, and you need to cite it within the context of what the field of study that you're engaging in the class. Okay, most of the time, particularly those who are not English majors, you'll be citing APA, right? American Psychological Association, right? If you're a architect, I think it's Harvard or Chicago style. English classes are all MLA format. It's all modern language associations. You have to cite it that way. Okay, and again, it's not that difficult of a citing format, but it's necessary. Okay. If you don't know how to cite through MLA, talk to your embedded tutor. Again, that's what they're there for, is to help you out. Okay. For this particular essay, since I already know what the sources are, you don't need to give me a works cited page. You don't need to present work citations at the end of the essay. You only do it for outside sources that I don't know, right? But you definitely need to cite in the text itself. Okay, which was simply, parentheses, author's last name, and please provide a paragraph number if you don't necessarily need it. It just makes it easier for me to find the quoted passage if I know what the paragraph number is. Okay? All right. And the other thing I want to mention is, okay, so one of the lessons that I gave you, and I think it's the lesson that says, again, a little help here, is just an assortment of arguments. And I think there's 4 arguments per side, right? In other words, so let's think about the arguments for a mandate of a trigger warning policy. It protects those who face inequity issues because of a disability that they have. Again, PTSD is a disability, right? And under Title V, we have to address, and the ADA, to be ADA compliant, American with Disability Act, all colleges must comply to accommodating students, right? And so a trigger warning policy would be one way to address accommodation for those who suffer from PTSD, okay? Another argument for the trigger warning policy is that really it protects the college and the professor, right? If a student is offended by the material, they could point to the trigger warning and then say, it's already, we mentioned in the syllabus, I gave you a warning ahead of time, you should have told me that you might be, the material might be insensitive to you, right? And so those would be simply two arguments for why you would have such a policy. Okay. Arguments against it would be that all professors have academic freedom, and it should be voluntary. They know what they're teaching in the class. They should be able to teach without any restrictions for it, and thus it should be left up to the teacher to provide the trigger warning policy, as opposed to the college insisting that they put a trigger warning in the syllabus. Another argument would be that this is college, right? That anyone who might find these material offensive, there are a lot of materials that are offensive in the world, and there's not trigger warnings for all of those, right? And another argument with that would be that if you do suffer from PTSD, or you have a disability, or you're offended by certain materials, that we have counselors on campus that deal with such issues, right? A college professor like myself don't have the skills needed to deal with someone who's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so those would be arguments why such a policy wouldn't be necessary for a college. Okay, now I should mention that, you know, if you go through that lesson that I gave you, there was like 4 or 5 bullet points of arguments for and against such a policy. Do not put all 4 or 5 bullet points in your essay. Just focus on 1 or 2 arguments per side that you can use to support your thesis. Okay, don't overload or generalize the argument. Really be specific. Find the ones that you truly believe is right for you, right, and be able to argue that. Even if I disagree with you, right, and I do have issues when it comes to the trigger warning policies. I also have issues when it comes to academic freedom and the idea that a professor can teach whatever they want. As long as you give me a convincing argument, then I will at least see how you are supporting it, and I'll be, I'll grade you on that. Okay, I'm not going to grade you politically when it comes to an argument, right? You just have to be able to present it in a way where I can see how you're getting to that particular point. Okay? Any other questions about that? So after you do that, so that's the body parts of your essay, right? And again, I could see how one can be for or against a mandate of it. Again, to me, it's not that big of a deal. It's just a sentence in a syllabus, and if it does anything to help out anyone who has and needs accommodations, it's a simple correction, right? But I also can see why it should be really up to the professor and not be a mandate across the college too, right? Professors, I've seen professors present material that's completely controversial, right? I've known a professor who would, show right on the white screen projected the Muhammad cartoons, right? And he was using it in a way that was, critical thinking. But I could see that if I was a Muslim student, I would be completely shocked by that portrait, right? To the point where I would be unable to focus on what I'm learning, right? And all of this comes down to, sort of treating the other person with some sort of respect. But you could do that without a policy, right? But some would argue that you do have these rogue professors who teach whatever they want to teach, and they are completely insensitive when it comes to the needs of the student, right? Again, all those should be considered when you're actually figuring out what side you are on this particular debate. Okay? Conclusion. So the conclusion of your essay should be not a restatement of the thesis. I don't know who taught students that they should repeat their thesis at the end of the essay. It's for such a short essay, it's unnecessary for you to repeat your thesis, right? I would choose an if-then statement, right? So you would argue if there was a mandate that required all professors to put in a trigger warning in their syllabus, then this would be the results, right? You're not going against your position, but you're putting it as a possibility, right? So you're really summarizing what you've been arguing, and then you will present it as such. If I summarize an event, do you still need us to define what trigger warnings are? You should, only because people don't know what it is, right? I'm sure you didn't know. A lot of people didn't know what a trigger warning was until they actually read the article. And again, these summaries don't need to be that long. It's just a couple of sentences so that the reader understands the situation, right? But you should summarize. You should define what trigger warnings are, okay, and how it would be implemented at the college, okay. So that's your 5-part essay. All right, and again, I implore you to look at the assignment closely. Make sure that you follow the prompt questions. Make sure that you use an example from previous lessons on how such a policy would be implemented in the class. Make sure that you use the readings given to you. Do not use outside sources, right? Focus on the readings. There's quite a bit of it. And make sure that you address the First Amendment in the essay itself, okay? Again, when you're supporting your argument, make sure that you quote and cite from the sources, and make sure that they're done in MLA format, okay, not APA. Other issues, so that's organization and content. Again, pretty straightforward. The other issues that I had with people's essays were grammar related, run-ons, fragments, subject-verb inconsistency, verb tense inconsistency too. Keep everything in one verb tense if you can, particularly if talking about an event that happened in the past. All of that should be, you should keep your sentences clear and concise. You should keep your paragraphs focused and concise, right? Just, make sure that a reader doesn't have, it's not struggling to see your point because of the grammatical errors. Okay. Anything else about the assignment? Again, this is an important one, so I want to make sure that you do well on it. It could really shift your how you do in the class. No, Kyle, you have a question? Kyle, the embedded tutor, how long is when is the last day that students can see the embedded tutor? I can't remember if it goes on until next week or it continues to finals week. That day is still shifting. Okay. Well, let's just say that students should be finished with at least a draft of their essays, so that if they have any questions about it, they could definitely see it by next week, the 3rd of June. So we'll go through the final exam. Okay, perfect. So let me just say this about the what's left in the class. So today's the 21st. Next week is the very last day of instruction. Okay. Again, there's not going to be a final exam, but you have this last essay that you need to turn in. I believe I have scheduled for it on the 29th, right? But as long as you get it to me before the 5th, I turn in grades on the 12th or the 11th, right? So I need 7 days to turn in grades, okay? So if you turn it in by the 29th, I could actually give it back to you sometime during finals week, and you could see what your grade will be in the class. Again, this won't be the sort of be-all, end-all of the grades in the class. I take a lot of other things in consideration. I look at whether or not you did the discussions, or whether or not you logged in frequently, looked at the assignments, looked at the lessons. All of that is just participation and attendance. None of that's going to be the reason why you would fail a class. but it can help boost up a grade. If I feel like you're in between two grades, a high attendance rate will get you to that higher level as opposed to a lower one. Okay. The final essay, if it shows improvement, I will basically let that essay's grade trump all the other essays you do in the class, right? Because at least it shows me that you're improving on the skills that you need, and that you can, go to the next level with those skills. Okay. If for some reason, and again, I hope it's not true, if you get a lower grade than what you've been turning in, right, then we really have to discuss how we would be able to pass you in the class, right? So if you fear that you might be getting a low grade in this class, and again, I want to make sure that everyone gets a good grade on this essay. I don't want to look at rewrites. I don't want you to turn in material late. I want you to turn it on time, too, because I want to give you a grade. I want to give you the grade that you deserve, and I want you to end off the year strong, right? Make sure that, again, you review, turn it in, but if you get a lower grade, then we'll talk about rewriting an essay. I just need to see something so that I can justify the grade that I give you, okay? I don't want to haphazardly give up grades just because I want to finish the semester, nor do I want to flunk people because, they messed up on following directions or something like that. I want to be able to be fair to you. I want to be able to give you the benefit of the doubt. But you need to show me something so that I could actually give you the grade based on whether or not you know the skills for this class. I should mention that since I turned back the commentary essay, that some people have been criticizing the grade that I give. Don't criticize the grade. Criticize the comments that I make, right? To me, and this will be part of a discussion set next week, to me, grades can be irrelevant, particularly if there's no backing of why a person got that particular grade, right? So if you're going to complain that you got a low grade on this commentary essay, I will be more than happy to talk about my grading process, but again, look at my comments that I give you. And most of the time, it's something as simple as you didn't quote and cite any of the sources, or you didn't do the MLA formatting of the essays itself, right? In other words, they're quite simple reasons why I gave a person a lower grade, okay? And something that can be easily corrected, okay? You didn't answer the prompt question. You didn't have a thesis early on, right? All of that are reasons why I give a low grade. So again, make sure that when you look at, when I give you back your essays, that you just simply don't look at the grade and just throw up your hands and saying, I'm not going to pass this class, this guy's a jerk, right? Again, I go through everybody's essays and I look at certain things to make sure that you've learned the skills. Also, when you turn in something like a commentary or an argumentative essay, do not use loaded language or hyperbole, right? The president, even if you like him or not, you have to admit that he just blows things out of proportions. And those are called hyperboles. Those are exaggerations. None of that has backing, scientific backing or research backing behind it, right? And that's one of the reasons why people criticize him, right? Because he overinflates things. On the commentary essays, I saw a lot of overinflations. The assumption that one has to be an idiot if they didn't agree to you, right? And to me, that's a loaded words. Those are can't even be argued, right? Because it's simply a subjective opinion about something, right? And it's an exaggeration. You can find reasons why it's not true, right? Simply because it's overinflated, right? You want to make sure that when you present even an argumentative essay, that you give research, that you give thought behind why you think a certain way, and you want to be able to support it through published research, right? That's why I gave you the sources to look at in order to come up with arguments, okay? If I get, for example, a C on the next essay, can I redo? Well, that's what I'm hoping to avoid. I don't want C papers in an essay. However, if I do feel like there's an essay that was turned in that didn't follow the instructions, and I have to give it a low grade because I can't even grade it in the context of other essays in the class, then we'll talk about rewriting that essay. But again, we're running out of time of this in the semester. We only have a week. We're really a week and a half left in the semester. So whatever you want to try and pull to improve your grade, I'll try and give you as much as I can. But really, after June 5th, that's the end of the class. Let me say a couple more things too. Some people still have to turn in essays. Do it. Again, I need to see something to justify your grade, and I would hate to give you a default failing grade just because I haven't seen anything that you turned in. You have to give me something, okay? The other thing too is some people missed discussions. I've been giving partial credit to people who've emailed me late discussions. But again, the discussions themselves is really for attendance and participation. Some of them require you to respond to a post, which you cannot do. So I'm willing to negotiate or bargain with you about the discussions, but they're not as important to your overall grade than the essays are. The essays themselves are what I can see as validating your grade in the class. Okay, that's why I want to make sure that everyone does well on this essay, and they don't turn anything that's a C paper. I don't want to see C papers. I love to see B and A papers. And again, all of that has to do with organization, content, and grammar. Okay? Any other questions about the assignment or what's left in the class? We're almost finished here. Again, my plan is not really to have a live conference for next week, unless you want it. But really, everything should be there. You can always contact me through email or through messages if you want to talk to me directly about your essays or anything about the class itself. If this is the last time I'll see you, I wish you the best of luck. Again, I'm here to help you up to June 5th. And try and give me whatever you can so I can make sure that you get a good grade in the class. Even if you're not doing that well so far, you can still pull off a good grade in the class. I'm not, prone to giving people bad grades. I want to give them, I want to give people the grade that they deserve, but I need to see something that shows it. Okay? So if there's no other questions about that, again, best of luck. I wish you all, a good remaining of the semesters. We're almost finished. This was a tough one. Being the chair of the department, I found it not just tough on my side, but tough overall with other faculty members and students in particular. Again, we're here to help you. I know the summer and fall is going to be stronger. People will be a lot more organized. I definitely will be. If you haven't registered or enrolled in summer or fall, do so now because it might be crowded. There might be an overwhelming number of students coming in to the community colleges. Okay, that's it. I will talk to you later, or I'll see you later. Email me, message me if you have any questions. Best of luck. Sure, it was my pleasure.